So I've kept thinking about the Russian sci-fi slash Ender's Game inspired thoughts about like self and the other relationships, both healthy and unhealthy, um, between cultures, species, people, different groups within a society. I'm also trying to become woke and get many different perspectives these days. So I've obviously been thinking a lot about that, or like watching things about like marginalized groups, and also um, just watched a, speaking of like the interspecies thing, I just watched a Jacob Geller video, Geller, about fear of big things in the deep water. So like giant squid, basically. And that also ties into that paradigm of like the other. It was really touching. It was a really good video. And it got me thinking about the different ways, just like different paradigms, different patterns of relating the self and the other. I do have it's sort of a messy thought, which is if we take this square as being like this self, in-group world, your established kind of framework of existence, and then there's like the margins on the outside. There are different ways of relating to that which is other, stranger, chaos, or just marginalized aspects of your own frame. And those are all sort of, there are different paradigms that we see applied to all of these. So I thought of 4, and one of them is like, if you have a barrier, or there, because Jonathan Pedro said about like, there needs to be a barrier between you and the stranger, I guess we're in the perspective of the people in the square. So you and the stranger, for both your protection, because there can be like, it can hurt both of you. So I guess like in one frame, there can be like a sort of wall and like a barrier in some sense with the people in the group inside, or maybe with both sides, treating the other with like an awe, like with ignorance, but like with an awed and respectful sort of ignorance. And like distance, but like with sort of wonder and awe sort of distance. Thinking about that, and that was mostly from the Geller video, because he was talking about sea creatures and how. Yeah. So anyway, there can be almost like a boundary that's healthy for the time being, which is done in a spirit of reverence, versus a boundary out of like fear and like demonizing sort of ignorance, where the in-group puts up walls and like is ignorant about what's on the other side and the other, but like is demonizing them and is putting up those walls like for our own safety and like to keep us in. And that's not good. And that's a way that this kind of distance, which can be good and establish like healthy boundaries in some cases, can become unhealthy. Obviously, the best thing would be if there was like mutual communication on our own terms with the other. Although, I bring up like the reverent and odd boundary because there always are going to be, right? Like the margins, as Pajot talks about, like the margins are a part of the cosmos. There's always going to be, not necessarily, there don't have to be like marginalized and oppressed like groups in our society necessarily. There would always be other cultures that are not ours, or other species, or like the deep sea creatures, or monsters. Like there's always some level of margins, and so there's always like a beyond with which we cannot safely communicate, or with which So in that case, like the whole reverent like space or barrier is like relevant. Anyway, that could develop into, and we are always like working towards, right, like breaking or softening that barrier and having like mutual communication on our own terms, with each side giving like mutual respect, right, and respecting the other's experience, and translating and working out a language between them. Obviously, that would be at varying degrees of difficulty. If it's another human being, that's rather easier than if it's another like if it's a giant squid or like an alien, but it can go wrong in both cases, and it could go right, you know, in both cases. But either way, there's this pattern of worth, so there's not as much of a barrier. They're becoming integrated. There's dialogue and mutual communication on each one's own terms, with the other being allowed to tell their own story and be respected as like the authority of their own experience. And that's more about marginalized groups. Like a lot of what I heard and what is true is like marginalized groups, the main stories are stories about them, and like people would just see them as their labels and not believe them about their own experience. I'm getting hungry and distracted, so I'm going to pause this. I return. So, there's like healthy distance with this sort of respectful ignorance, and then there's distance or boundaries gone wrong. There's healthy communication with each side being equal and respected. And then there's unhealthy communication, which is interesting. And it's the same sort of pattern can be seen with all kinds of different others, whether that be people within a society or different species or different cultures. Anyway, it's like, so you taking the other and dragging them forcibly into that like square world where they don't fit, like dragging them forcibly into that hostile and strange environment for them, and then like picking them apart, trying to figure them out, imposing, like trying to understand the other in very much in the terms of the like in group and fit into your own box with no reciprocal. And so the image, well, the Jacob Geller video talked about the giant squid, right? And pausing a lot to make sure that I don't sound like I'm like trying to dehumanize humans or marginalized groups, which is done a lot, but I'm not attempting to do that. Anyway, so he was talking about the giant squid, and so like there's one paradigm of relating to them where there is this odd sort of ignorance about them, and then there is the communication on the own terms. If we might be able to initiate that by filming them in their own environment, which we've done, and like seeing them as majestic sort of creatures. They have their own story, they have their own sort of life down there, and that's, you start to glimpse that when you send the researchers like down there. But the way that it's often been done is like in this, you have a sick or a slow member of the species or dead that like gets washed up, or that gets caught, it's confused, it's out of its milieu, it's out of its home, it's like collapsing under the pressure and like dying, and then people will like dissect this thing or preserve it and like have it in a museum or something and think that we understand it or define the creature based upon that type of communication. Bringing the other being into the pre-existing, established in-group self kind of world, and just like imposing it. Yeah, which is sad with the giant squid, and it's even sadder when it's done to other people. But just that like image reminded me of some other things that I had come across. One of which was the thing about marginalized groups not being able to tell their own stories and being seen as defined by what other people told about them from the outside. The other of them being that, like, a lot of the time, marginalized groups will, like, their identity is seen as defined by suffering, defined by oppression, and defined by, like, pain, or, like, by being these, like, odd, sort of standing out. Yeah. Instead of seen as having an internal, like a pleasant, like a good and valid sort of experience as well. So this could be like a lot of these people we're talking about, trans people and LGBTQ people, and how most of the time it's others telling their stories, and then the stories, or I guess like racial minorities as well, tends to be defined by suffering, which was just from that. And then it reminded me also of this one Tumblr post that pointed out how a lot of criterion for identifying autistic people is how autistic people behave when they're upset. So, like, first of all, the world that they're born into really is not their proper home. It's not designed for them. It's not comfortable, and so to the extent that, like, the defining characteristics in the eyes of the other people are really abnormal in that group or that person, that identity, that kind of life under distress. Yeah. Another thread connecting to this is just funny, or something that I've been thinking about: shame and, like, social shame, and also the internalized voice of that many of us internalize, is very good at doing this kind of thing, dragging out the others and trying to, like, dissect them and fit them, like imposing, using fear and shame, this sort of ideal of normalcy that, first of all, doesn't often exist really, and or isn't healthy. It just falls apart when you poke at it close enough. And second of all, isn't everything. You can't fit everything into that box. Anyway, and it's surprisingly tempting, I think, for me to side with that voice just out of habit, and, like, reject and push away anything that might seem strange or out of the box. And half the time this is me attacking myself, and half the time it's attacking or, like, avoiding others. And it's just, there's no need to listen to that voice. It's usually, or basically not ever right. It's the wrong tone. It's the wrong tone. I don't think I really have a thesis here. These are just some images, some like patterns that are apply in different places and connected ideas and references that string together in my head. It's quite interesting. Like, so lastly, I guess, there's lots of groups onto which this paradigm of like the other or the stranger or like the margins or some like forces of like chaos is applied, whether that be other species imagined or literally other species, foreign people from other cultures, autistic people or people with mental illnesses, LGBTQ community, children, adulthood, as like, well, less so that, I guess, but in the sense of understanding adulthood as like this, you like shut down, you lose all the joy of life and the joy of imagination, you just become like, life is suffering from then on. And honestly, in strands of a lot of traditional narratives, existence itself, and especially like the bodily existence, gets the same treatment, like the same other like the same like marginalized treatment of being considered a defect and of being like defined by suffering and like stigmatized and rejected as something that we want to come out of and escape, which I found interesting. And I think it's true, it's like kind of the same pattern, and I think for the same reasons in both cases. So like, okay, you might have a religious narrative that says that there's God or like the source, and as you descend down into existence, that is defined by being separated and more cut off from the source, and like that's bad. And obviously the body is, yeah, so like there's only like pure bliss and happiness and complete undifferentiated going back to that source, and anything below that, like the spirit is pretty good, the body corrupt, bad. I'm not saying that like that's the primary narrative of any full tradition. I don't think it is, but it's quite a common like sort of concept that just goes around, floating around. Yeah. The Children of the Light from Wheel of Time. It's a fictional, so less conflict. Anyway, yeah, it's just funny because it's like the same paradigm of like, if you take like the source as the world, as the like self, as like that, the like square, anything outside of that is bad, is to be fled from, is just defined by suffering and by abnormality, corruption, etc. And I think in each case, like the reason why a certain identity is defined by suffering is because it's like in a hostile environment, being dragged into like a hostile environment and defined in there, and like not in a safe space where it can flourish as itself. But obviously when like embodied particular time finite existence is healthy, and which is rare, right? It is like healthy and given a safe space on it to flourish, we can see that it is actually good and has a voice of its own and is not just about suffering and cycles of ignorance. And of course, similarly, any othered or marginalized group, if given their own voice and language and space, has a story and a valid perspective and like joy and positive identity rather than simply being identified as not, as like on the outside. Oh, and I said that subreddit, what is it called? Gatekeeping, Yaoi, Gatekeeping Yuri, I don't know how those are pronounced, is that an example of this? It is. That's an example of turning unhealthy self-other into healthy self-other kind of, or in-group, out-group, or whatever kind of dynamics, because it takes like comics about, I guess they call it gatekeeping, but like societal cliches of one societal group that's against another, like sort of hating each other or envying each other or whatever, and then just like ships them together and shows them cute and still with their differences, but in loving communication with each. It's funny. It's, like I find those very deeply satisfying and beautiful, like in a quite concise, like quite concisely get across. I think something powerful. Yeah. But it's just interesting to think about. All of the different ways of, because there's always going to be an in-group and an out-group, and of course that shifts depending on your perspective where you are, but like there's always going to be that. We can be always expanding the comfort zone and always like expanding the world and bringing in new groups to find a place and bring everything into more, but there's always going to be something out there beyond the borders, and how to relate to that. A lot of nuance and different patterns. Yeah. To be honest, I don't know. I think I should not say self-deprecating things about the coherence of the videos, because it doesn't add anything. It doesn't make them any more coherent. And like, if you're bored by it, you would just stop watching. Whereas if you are watching, you just find it charming or whatever. But I feel obliged to acknowledge that I know that I'm not presenting a thesis, but rather just a collection of ideas, very much in my own terms, in the way that I would put it to myself, which is probably not the way that another person would put it. But anyway, everybody has some concept of the self and the other, and the inside and the outside, and conflict between different groups and ways of communicating without dragging them in forcibly into our own environment and defining them based on our own terms. Also, let the squids be squids in there. I should probably not have the primary metaphor of this be the squids, because the opposite of what I want to do is perpetuate the whole, like, putting marginalized groups further out into the other, like dehumanizing humans. Humanize the squids.